Hello and welcome to the Rabyd Atheist. I'm Ed Rabyd, a former pastor turned atheist, now compassionate anti-theist. Welcome to my channel. If you want to learn how to support this channel, its mission to normalize atheism and deconversion, stay tuned to the end of the video. Today I'm officially starting my series of videos on morality without God. I feel to start out we need to briefly justify why we are sailing out of the sea of divine command theory to find something else. To keep our analogy of a journey, we should probably first of all look at what the sea of divine command theory was supposed to provide for us and why we find it inadequate. So let's ask ourselves, what did the people who advocate for divine command theory say was real benefits to this theory? One, that it's objective. That God being the origin and regulator of morality, surely there is no better source for deciding what is right and wrong than God's unchanging law. The other thing that they promise is that God knows best. Because God is objective, as well as our creator, we may think that things are good for us, but God actually knows better for us, and that way his law is there for a reason. That these rules that we have to guide society are absolute. The rules are clear, and the Ten Commandments, being a good example of a clear stated set of rules that we need to follow. It also advocates our human responsibility. Goodness isn't subject to our misunderstanding of situations. Because our reasoning is fallible, we can follow God's law so as to safeguard against this idea of us going off the wrong path. And because God is inherently good, the Bible, that which he commands must also be good. And so therefore, following what God wants leads us to goodness in life. What's the problem with that? Well, I'm going to give you 7 good reasons, 7 of the best reasons to reject divine command theory. Number 1, it assumes that God is real, that you believe in God. The entire theory is dependent on whether or not God exists. In fact, one of the arguments for God is the moral argument. But that moral argument begs the question of God's existence, that there's a moral lawgiver in the first place. They automatically assume that this moral lawgiver is God, but nobody ever really proves God's existence. And so that kind of brings up the question of, do we actually have God's existence confirmed? I mean, you can't expect us atheists to accept the teachings of a being they really don't accept as real. So one of the weaknesses of divine command theory, then, is whether or not God actually exists. The second good or best reason to reject divine command theory is Ethereal's dilemma. It provides 2 problems. If morality stems from God, then is it arbitrary and capricious? Does it mean that these laws can change if God decides to change them? Because he obviously would have the power to change them if he wanted to. He has the ability and the right to change them because he's God. And because he makes these laws, then they can also be changed. Or, on the second half of the dilemma, if he makes these laws because they teach what is good, it implies that there's an external standard of goodness that's outside God himself, therefore challenging his omnipotence, his omniscience, the very nature of this omni-God in the first place. In fact, that would be the only thing that would make the standards of morality objective, is that they existed outside of every single human mind, every single human situation, and every single God mind and situation. If they stood outside of us and actually were just a standard of morality standing on their own that everybody acknowledged, then that would make God unnecessary because, well, the standard exists whether he exists or not. Also, another problem with this is the arbitrariness. If God can change the laws whenever he wants, then morality isn't standard or objective. It's based on a whim. An example would be God's constant commands in the Bible to not kill, and then constantly directing his people to commit genocide against other human beings. I think a lot of people reject it. When I was a theist, this is one of the reasons I rejected determinism. The reason I rejected determinism is because it made us God's plaything, which seems relevant here too as well. Religious pluralism. How do we know which rules are right? But a better question would be, do we know which God in particular exists? I almost wanted to put this one first because it's the real issue. Which God are we talking about that has to be proven to exist? And thus we would know which moral code is actually the right one. The fact is, religious systems often have different moral codes. For instance, the rule of Hinduism says you have to eat vegetarian meals, that the eating of meat and other things is immoral because of their ideas and beliefs about reincarnation. But in Leviticus, it teaches that we can eat certain kinds of meat, but not others. And then there are other systems that have no dietary restrictions. So this really adds to the question of which religious system of laws is true, because then we have to establish first before that, which God are we talking about here? This is an inherent weakness with divine command theory, because who's given the commands? Which divinity exists? Becomes a big question, because all religions seem to reflect a different idea of which divinity exists, and consequently, which legal system is the one we should be following. Number 5. Pluralism of interpretation. Religious believers choose to reinterpret some aspects of their religion all the time. Whenever we look at these supposed unchanging laws of God, for instance, in the Old Testament, Jews, for instance, still do not wear wool and linen together, but Christians don't care about that. They believe that all has been fulfilled in Christ, and so the law is no longer necessary. The interpretation of many laws depends. You can even get a discussion on what constitutes murder, what constitutes sexual assault, so on and so forth, from these supposed arbitrary rules and teachings. And Christianity and Judaism and Islam aren't the only ones with this problem. All religions seem to be subject to the interpretation of their followers. This makes it very subjective. It's probably one of the biggest reasons you can say that the CV of divine command theory is very subjective, because we're all arguing about who this divine authority is and what he commanded, and to what extent those commands are to be followed. The next problem comes in conflict with modern life and human law. For instance, Leviticus teaches us not to lie as a man with a woman, but our human laws protect the rights of all citizens, including, say, transsexuals, homosexuals, etc. In addition, the Bible also very clearly advocates for slavery, gives rules for handling of slaves, which are now completely obsolete and unnecessary, given the fact that most human laws and most places reject the idea of human slavery. Although it's still practiced, it's still looked down upon now, whereas it wasn't before. And this seems to indicate that as human beings get better and better at treating each other well in certain places, that somehow the morality is shifting and it pulls away from these divine commands. We're beginning to question whether or not these divine commands were good in the first place. And I think that that's kind of a weakness of divine command theory. It's part of the interpretation problem, but it's also the problem of which God and which moral system are we following again. The final problem with divine command theory is it's so absolute. It creates a difficult problem. Sabbath laws are broken by Jesus, but a guy who carried sticks in the Old Testament was killed for that. But Jesus' disciples literally harvest grain, and somehow it's not a problem. This actually is the problem with the story of a lot of the gods, not just the God Yahweh, but a lot of the gods seem to be, either very absolute on certain things or completely arbitrary or completely random. It seems like the gods can't really make up their mind on what parts of their moral code they're supposed to enforce as well. This seems to be a problem in all religions, and that's why I think the divine command theory just has way too much subjectivity into it. Well, I would be the last one to say that there isn't some sort of morality that is subjective. I don't think that there is an objective morality at all. Divine command theory certainly enters a lot of subjectivity, most notably, which God are we talking about, and thus which moral code are we actually supposed to follow, and how are we supposed to interpret that code becomes the basic eroding force under almost all of divine command theory. Prove your God exists, that he gave a moral code, and this is the moral code that he gave, and here we go, how are we supposed to properly interpret it, and can you prove that? This is probably the essence of the weaknesses of the divine command theory. It just has no foundation. You think it's calm and serene on the top because it gives us this arbitrary, absolute rules. We don't have to take human responsibility for ourselves because God has told us the way to live to a good life. The problem is what a good life is very subjective. Maybe what a good life is to God is not necessarily beneficial for the person who follows his laws. For instance, if the law of slavery from the Old Testament was maintained, then that's not going to be good for the slaves. They're definitely going to be used and at the expense of somebody else that owns them. Whereas we have kind of in modernity realized that the best way to benefit everybody is to get rid of the institution of slavery so everybody has an equal chance. And that seems to be an improvement compared to some of the arbitrary commands of the God Yahweh. But other religions also have this problem, given that there are, well over, 50,000 deities and religious systems. There's about 4,000 religions and systems in which those deities exist. Which one is the one that we're supposed to be following? Which list of commandments or rules or principles am I supposed to be following based on the God that actually supposedly exists? A lot of the criticism of divine command theory is this. It assumes a particular God, the omni-God, exists, which assumes a monotheistic viewpoint, which a lot of other religions would reject. And it also assumes that this God gave commands, which deists would say they wouldn't accept that either. The fact is, if divine command theory is so great, why do we have so many arguments about it? And why can't we establish if God exists, which God he is, and whether or not he's given some sort of commands that we're supposed to follow? For me, these all became reasons to reject. Until a theist answers a lot of things like the Ethereal's dilemma, what are we left with? Where are we going from here? Well, I think we need to have some discussion about certain elements of moral philosophy before we start looking at certain schools of thought. And I think what we really do need to do is start looking at things like cultural relativism, whether subjective and objective morality are possible, other things that are involved in the moral question before we move on to specific schools. And I think I'm going to start with cultural relativism. I'm going to head that direction for my next video because I think we need to have a good discussion about it. And whether or not morality can be even objective will be a good discussion for the video that follows. But I wanted to, first of all, justify the fact that we're moving on without God because God, whoever that God may be, he or she or whatever, whether they gave commands and how those commands should be interpreted, just adds way too much subjectivity to the question of morality. It's almost like religions borrow morality from the society around them. They steal the best aspects in order to promote themselves as being part of that society. It's almost like they're interwoven together, and religion just seems to borrow from everybody else and then just claims to have it be a divine authority. I'm not really sure that that's a good way to do morality. It's just not a good system of creating a moral system in the first place, because it's subject to the whim of whatever God people decide to believe in, whatever moral code that God supposedly gave, and then it's still subject to the interpretation of the people that believe. And for those of us that are trying to move on with an actual moral system that works, that has a practical application value to everyday life, this isn't very useful. And these are 7 of the best reasons to get rid of it. Well, thanks for stopping by. I appreciate everybody coming by. Like, share the video, do the things that you guys do. The whole purpose of this channel is to normalize atheism and deconversion, where a person being an atheist or deconverting from all religions isn't considered some sort of weirdo, but instead it's pretty normal and should be treated as a very reasonable alternative to anything else or a God belief. And so that's my mission, to kind of get rid of the myths, dispelling all those myths around deconversion and dispelling the myths around atheism. If you want to support that, there's a lot of good ways to do that. My PayPal link is in the description. There's also Super Chat, Super Thanks. You can always do that as well. But the best way, of course, is to become a member of the channel, to become a citizen of the Rabyd Nation, because then you're supporting me monthly, and I worry less and less about the YouTube algorithm and more about producing the content that actually normalizes atheism and normalizes deconversion. So if you want to join them, hit that join button and join the nation. And I just want to give a shout out to my members, to my citizens, to my Rabyd citizens, to my tribunes. Thank you very much for your continued monthly support. It really does this old preacher turned atheist YouTuber heart good to see that. It's an emotional uplift for me, not just the financial support. So thank you very much for that. And as always, live your best life. You only get one go around and then it's over. So You want to make sure you're taking all your time, your money, and opportunities and giving them to yourself, the people you love and care for, and to make this a better world. And don't waste them on the trappings of religion and faith, because that's a dead end. I speak from experience. And as always, thanks for stopping by, and I'll catch you next time.